an environment group called the Merriweather Greenies, and we had some opposition early on. We had a group of Year 11 boys set up a group called the Merriweather Industrialists. They all wanted to go and work in mining, and we were getting our school to switch to, recycling and planting trees around the school and doing lots of environmental campaigning as well. But that was my first experience in the lesson that when you're trying to make change, when you're trying to intervene in a system, no matter how small, even if it's just setting up a recycling system, you'll always have forces pushing back against you. And one of the most important lessons that I've had to learn as someone who has exercised leadership on climate in a whole range of spaces is that if people aren't against you, you're probably not being effective. And I think particularly for young women, this is a lesson that's really important to learn, because women are raised in most families in Australia with the lesson that you've got to be liked, you've got to be nice, you've got to be likeable. And that's a really strong cultural thing that's ingrained in us. Women more so than men, but I mean everyone. So to come up against that when you start kind of making waves and making change, it can be a really hard thing to get your head around. People won't like you all the time, and that's okay. So I set up this group in my school. We took on this big campaign. A couple of you might have heard this story before, that there was a big company, who's heard of BHP. So BHP wanted to build a mine about 40 minutes north of our school. Who's heard of Bob Carr, Foreign Minister? So he was the Premier of New South Wales at the time. And he wanted to let this mine go ahead. And my high school group started organising to try and stop that mine. And it took 2 years of campaigning. We started with just knocking on every door in Newcastle, dropping a banner from the highest building in Newcastle, which was the council car park in the city. We dressed up as koalas, we dressed up as bushrangers. We pretty much invented all of these costumes because we quickly realised we could get in the newspaper if we put on a costume. That was our theory of change. And it worked. We got a lot of media attention. We met with the local council, we met with all of the stakeholders, we met with the state government, and it was a coalition campaign between the local environment group, the high school students, the Warramai people, the traditional owners, because there were a lot of sacred sites on this place that BHP wanted to mine, and with a group of residents who didn't want to see the mine go ahead. And we won. To cut a very long story very short, we won. By the time I finished my HSC, that mine didn't go ahead. Meanwhile though, this thing that I'd learned about in Year 5 was getting worse. It was getting much worse, and we were running out of time to solve it. So already now, we have warmed the atmosphere by an average of almost 1 degree Celsius. And 1 degree might not sound like very much, but 1 degree has been enough to create droughts that a couple of years ago were so bad in Russia that the Kremlin banned wheat and corn exports. They didn't have enough to feed their people. 1 degree was enough to cause havoc in agricultural systems all around the world, contributing to massive famines in Africa, and of course the drought that's still ongoing in southwestern WA in Australia. 1 degree has been enough to cause a huge increase in the amount of devastating floods that have happened in Bangladesh, in Pakistan, and in Australia. 1 degree has already changed the acidity of our oceans and the composition of our atmosphere. Now, a year ago, I guess over a year ago, I was lucky enough to be at a really important place when it comes to talking about leadership on climate change. I went to a place called Mauna Loa. Does anyone know what that is? Want to explain?
It's in Hawaii.
Yes.
It's an observatory.
Yeah, exactly. So it's an observatory on one of the highest peaks in Hawaii. It's an old dormant volcano. And a man called Charles David Keeling, he started measuring the composition of carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere. When I was up there, he started doing that in about 1950. And he did it, I'm going to pass this around. This is a little sample of the air from Mauna Loa that I was given when I was at this observatory. And you can see the trend of carbon pollution levels going up and up and up. They've gone up over 40% since 1950. So I'll pass it around. And the amazing thing about Charles David Keeling is that he kept measuring the levels of carbon pollution in the atmosphere even when he ran out of funding, even when people said, why are you doing this? There's nothing happening here. You're in a remote place in Hawaii, like not even near the beach. Why do you keep bothering? He kept going, even when he wasn't certain of what he was going to find, even when he had no money and people were laughing at him, because he knew that there was an important story to be told. And I think that's another important thing about leadership. You keep going even when you don't really know where it's going to end up. Often we don't know the full consequences of our actions until many, many years later. There's another story that I'll quickly tell about that I think symbolises the same point. It's from the feminist movement in the UK, when people were campaigning for women to get the right to vote. And this was written about many years later. There was a group of women who every Friday afternoon, they stood on the steps of Parliament and they handed out leaflets to parliamentarians talking about why women should get the right to vote. And one of them wrote in her diary one Friday evening, went out to Parliament House again today, stood in the rain, handed out leaflets, felt complete despair. No one was listening to us, why am I bothering? About 5 or 6 years later, one of the parliamentarians gave a speech on the eve of legislation being brought in to give women the right to vote. And one of the things he said was, the moment that I first started thinking about this issue seriously was this Friday afternoon where I saw this group of women, and they were always there, but the weather that day was particularly bad. And yet they were still there handing out their pamphlets. And so I took one that day, and that was when I started to think, if they were so committed to come every day, even in the rain, then I should at least read what they have to say. So at that exact moment that activist felt that she was making no impact, it actually was a huge step forward. That's why I think the same principle applies to Keeling. He didn't know how important his work would end up being, but he kept going, and it's provided us with the scientific understanding so that we do now know what's happening to our planet, and we can take leadership interventions to try and stop that curve going up even further. And I think the other thing to keep in mind when we're talking about leadership on these issues, because they are so big and so overwhelming, with a 1 degree impact. I know that we already understand what's happening to Australia because we've just lived through this angry summer. But we shouldn't think that just because we're young, we can't change things. So Martin Luther King was 25 years old when he told America that he had a dream. And Mahatma Gandhi was 24 years old when he started getting involved in the South African civil rights movement, which was the first step on his journey to freeing India from colonisation. And Charlie Perkins was 29 years old, an amazing Indigenous Australian leader when he led the freedom rides throughout regional and rural Australia to end segregation in towns like Moree, where you had the swimming pool and white people could go in and Aboriginal people couldn't. He was 29. William Wilberforce, who was at the forefront of ending slavery, was 27 when he started that campaign, when he started to get really involved. And in 1836, there was a young woman called Harriet Hanson who led hundreds of women and girls out of a textile mill in northern Massachusetts to protest and strike for better conditions and higher wages. And she was 11 years old. So anytime someone tells you, okay, maybe you care about climate change, maybe you care about the environment, but you're too young to do something about it, wait until you're a CEO, wait until you've graduated uni, tell them about Harriet Hanson, remind them of Dr. King, because there's this thing in our society that says, okay, you go to primary school, you go to high school, you go to uni, you do your master's degree, you do your PhD, and then you're ready for the world. What is that? That doesn't make any sense. You've lived a third of your life by the time that's already happened. We only have like 60 years left, all of us, before we're going to die. So why would we want to waste a third of it getting ready when we can actually exercise leadership and influence the world around us right now? So that was my attitude back as a little kid, and after we won that campaign to stop the mine, it made me realise that we could actually have an impact. I went to Sydney Uni, I got a scholarship to study up there, and I got really involved in the campus environment movement. And when you think about leadership, I think it's important to consider your circle of influence. Who's read the book 7 Habits of Highly Effective People? Some of you. So who wants to explain the circle of concern, circle of influence? Zach? Do you remember that?
I read it quite a long time ago.
Has anyone read it more recently and remembers that concept? No? Okay, well basically Stephen Covey says everyone has a circle of concern, which is the things that we care about, and everyone also has a circle of influence, which is the ability that we have to create change in our immediate environments using the networks that we have. And our challenge, if we want to be effective at exercising leadership, is to be really focused on